I'm here to save you money. That's right, I spent a lot of money on this hobby, and I've wasted even more. Let's find out what not to buy when you're starting out in the fishing world. Sorry in advance for not having my co-star with me today, but I'm currently working away from home in a camp, so I have to fly solo for this one. If you're learning to get into fishing for yourself, or you're looking to get your kid into fishing, there's a few things I personally recommend that you do or think about before you rush out and buy a ton of gear. Let's jump in. First thing, right out of the gate, and this might piss a few people off, but fishing line. This is obviously dependent on what you're fishing for, but for a general outline, let's dive into this a little bit. My brother-in-law learned to fish with my baitcaster, and he fell madly in love with it. So naturally, I pointed him out a good deal for him, and he went out and got it. But he also brought some really cheap monofilament line. Not to be confused with fluorocarbon, they're both clear, but monofilament is your most common, generally comes on your standardized pre-bought rods or your pre-spooled rods, and this is the most common and usually the cheapest line. You can get good quality monofilament, but this monofilament he bought was way too heavy. He bought 20-pound monofilament line, and it just made his rod cast crap. His reel was over spooling, couldn't do anything properly. He was getting super frustrated. He thought I pointed him out to a wrong bait caster. Well, needless to say, within an hour of fishing, he cut that line off and he put on some of my expensive Power Pro braided line, and he thought he could cast 100 feet. He was loving it. He was so obsessed with this new line. He went out and bought a whole crap load. Needless to say, moral of the story is do not cheap out on line. Line is the biggest thing to help you learn to cast properly. And yeah, you might back spool it. You might have to cut it off sometimes. You might have to waste a little bit of it while you're learning. But let me tell you, in the long run, you're going to regret buying that cheap line and over again and figuring out why you suck with that bait caster or that spinning rod. Trust me, don't cheap out online and get the good stuff. Second of all, avoid the marketing of fishing rods and reels. When I started bass fishing, I of course turned to YouTube and watched guys like the Guggen Squad and Tactical Bassin', and next I convinced my wife that I got out and got a $400 rod. I was so excited, but pretty inexperienced at the time, and then guess what? I broke that thing in like 2 days. I slammed it in a door. And now, I do have more expensive fishing gear, but guess what? I take care of it and know what to do with it. But you might not yet. Don't fall victim to the marketing and feel like it'll make you a better fisherman or something to have more expensive stuff, because it doesn't. All it does is wreck your bank account. And when you try and yank your hook off of a tree that you're hung up on, or you snap your rod and slam it in a car door, or you walk through your garage trying to get your rods out and you snap it on a roof truss trying to get it out, you'll be devastated and almost like you shouldn't be fishing at all. Yeah, bit of personal experience there. I bet you guys have some horror stories. Let's hear them in the comments below. The third thing is putting way too heavy of line on their rod. They see all these guys using 50-pound braid, chucking frogs, and think, well, if I just put big line on my rod, I won't have to, nothing will break. I can fish any kind of lure with it. That's wrong. If you're throwing a Senko or a finesse worm or something where you need to have a little bit of a camouflaged approach to it, 50-pound braid is too much. They'll see the line, they'll know not to eat that worm or not to eat whatever you're throwing on the end of it. I tell beginners all the time, if I had to choose one size line to put on my new reel for you're fishing bass, I would use 10 to 20 pound braid. If you're going to fish pike, I would use probably 10 to 20 pound braid as well. You need it to be thin enough to be invisible for finesse and strong enough to even do a little bit of topwater fishing. Now, if you're trout fishing or using smaller fish like panfish, or you're going for some other small species, you usually don't go over 6. I do have 50-pound braid on my frogging rod, but that's not to say everyone should be using it. It's just not needed. But again, you got to know what you're trying to go and catch. Some people go out and buy a combo rod from Walmart, and sometimes these are great rods for beginners. They usually come with a standard 6 to 8 pound mono. Now, if you're going into a deep lake and you're looking to try and haul in some pike without a steel leader, you might end up pretty disappointed. One more thing I want to touch on quickly is storage. Some guys have a rod that they've had for 10 years sitting in their garage, and they haven't used it in ages, and thought, hey, I kind of want to get into fishing. I'm going to go take that rod out. Then they get out on the water. First thing they catch, the first thing that happens to them is either A, their line snaps because it's been sitting in their garage for years, or B, their rod snaps. These things deteriorate over time. If you have a cheap rod, replace it before you go out for the first time. And if you have a good rod with some cheap line on it, make sure to get some new line on it. And one of my last tips for you guys that I want to touch on that I burn money on, it felt like such a waste, is buying multiple rods to have on me. When you first get into the sport, you only need one rod. And sometimes specifically just one lure. You want to earn confidence in that rod and that lure. So you really don't need to switch it up 50 times. Use that one rod. Get used to it. Retie lures onto it. You need to learn the knots. If you want to catch fish, you got to be good at tying those knots. Get super comfortable with that rod. Learn its ins and outs, the way it casts, the way it bends when you catch a fish. Then in future, once you get more into it, then you can get more than one rod and do the same. You keep moving from there. You get used to each rod individually. Do not do what I do and go out and buy 12 rods because it's what you saw on YouTube and all these guys doing and you thought, I can be like that. It's just a waste of money and a waste of time. You end up only using one rod over the course of the whole trip and one lure on it, and it's just such a burnout. You don't need it. Just get used to the one, get used to retying a lure to that one specific rod, and get used to your knots. Also, to touch on that last point, if you're getting your kid geared up to go fishing, getting them cheap rods is totally fine. I'm going to be bringing out a few episodes on the do's and don'ts of starting out fishing for you, both you and your kid. But in the meantime, if you need to start from the basics, I got a video in the description on how to tie a fishing hook, and I'll be uploading in the video in the future of how to set up your new rods and how to do certain types of rigging. So just stay tuned and catch you guys next time.